Welcome to today's edition of the Mindshift Cards Conversation, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. In this episode, we're going to focus on a question from the Inventor Compass point, and that question is really around how our schools and organizations have embraced the future. So Rachel, I wonder if you kick us off with a conversation about how your schools or organization have embraced the future.
So this question is always such an interesting one to me because I think it's the one that's so difficult for schools. I do think that we're in a time where we're trying to look forward. We talk about things like 21st century learning, but it's not the future. That's the present because we're in the 21st century. And so I think it's just a really hard topic. And I think it's one that schools are trying to do more with. We talk about career readiness more. We hear forecasters talk about the number of students who are going to have jobs that don't exist yet. We're trying to talk about some essential skills and habits of mind to get students prepared. But I think the reality is that for the most part, a lot of us are still at least working in the present, if not working in the past, more often than not. In the way that we prepare students for the world, we prepare them for the world that we knew when we were in school or the world that we know now that we're out of school. And I think that focusing on the future is something that a lot of schools will say that they're doing or they're trying to do. But I think that more often than not, it's actually not the future. It's the present. Even when they bring in speakers to talk about their careers, that's not going to be the future. That's the current. That's the present. So I think it's a really tough task for schools.
I would agree, Rachel. And I think that thinking about the future is probably one of those things that's just so far off the radar, so to speak. And largely because it requires, I think, some specific knowledge, some skills, even some research. So I'd like to suggest a resource that schools can use specifically focused on the K-12 space and the idea of futures thinking. And that is KnowledgeWorks. If you Google KnowledgeWorks, you'll get to their website. They not only have a professional development arm, but they have a thought leadership arm of their organization that focuses specifically on identifying trends in K-12 education. And then every 4 years, they come out with a report that helps educators take those trends and start to plan for designing or redesigning systems in schools that will be more aligned with that direction of the future. So KnowledgeWorks, go check them out.
To be slight contrarian, I think Rachel, when you say things like, it's hard for schools, I wonder though, if they flipped the amount of time and energy they spend focused on the past, if it would allow for that to be a different approach. So I think the way that schools are currently constructed, everything we do is about, who we were 30 years ago or 60 years ago. And not just in our history classes, but kind of everywhere. And so I also think that it's important to note that future forecasting, maybe the goal there would not be to be accurate or right, although that would be a nice outcome, but the mindset that things are not knowable and that we need to build adaptable and agile thinking, and that part of what happens is we just ignore the future because it's messy and it's not tangible and we could be wrong. And so I think there's a way that our organizations are probably avoiding that, not just because it requires some skill and knowledge that most of us don't have yet, but it requires us to acknowledge that it's much safer to live in we use the words like inertia. It's just easier and safer to be in the past and maybe the present than it is to take a risk and predict what could be down the line. And I think the pandemic is a perfect example of a place where there were places that were far more prepared to instruct, and I chose that word purposely, using technology during the pandemic than others. And that's a place where I think people would pat themselves in the back and say we were somewhat ready because we had been predicting the future. And I think that that's a misstep on a lot of people's plates, because I think what they did was they just changed the methodology of delivery, which is not really what we're talking about when we talk about being future oriented. That's something that, not to put Randy in the spot, but I'd love to share a little bit because I know you've dabbled in it. As a leader, what kind of futures? It's not predicting the future. It's being mindful and thoughtful about what you want to be as an organization 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. And I think what's interesting is when you talk to people and you say, I'm interested in foresight, or I'm interested in, thinking about futures or futures thinking, they oftentimes have this image of like somebody looking around the crystal ball and going like, oh, in 10 years, this is what's going to happen. It's not that at all. And it's not predicting the future. Nobody can predict the future. But what you're doing with strategic foresight, basically in like 10 seconds here, is you're looking at current trends, things that are happening in the world right now, or things that are happening inside K-12 education. And you're saying, if those things evolve over the course of time, if we don't do anything, or if we change our behavior, how might that change? And how might that change focuses on the word that we have in our mind shifts, and that's possibilities. And so you say, here are the trends, here's a possible future. And there's different ways of giving some intensity to those different futures, probable, possible, things like that. And then you say, okay, if this is our preferred future, what has to change? What might change for that to come about? So it's sort of embracing our own agency and our own accountability for thinking about the future, and saying like, the future could look like this, and here's what we would really like it to look like. So what do we need to do differently? What sort of systems do we need to change? How do we need to change our thinking? And so it's moving into the possibility of a future that is based on things that are happening now.
One of the things I want to highlight that you mentioned is also a word that we use, which is also exploring. It's not just strategic foresight, but it's also doing it in adjacent fields. So I think one of the interesting tensions that we always feel is we want to value what we know as insiders in the K-12 space. But I think another blind spot, for lack of a better word, in education is we are oftentimes reluctant to look at what's happening in the adjacent spaces and learn from where they are, while we're oftentimes far behind what's happening in the business world. And again, I get all the reasons why we wouldn't, want to use the business world as a model. We're not producing widgets, and kids are not, in the language of, capitalistic systems. We're not trying to create a thing for market. But while we're so indignant about ignoring those things, we're also ignoring the lessons to be learned in those spaces that are adjacent. So I think that's another part that you kind of mentioned, and I just wanted to draw back out, is it's not just thinking about the future, but it's seeing the potential futures of lots of different industry or organizations along with our own.
I mean, one way to think about it sort of in very general terms is that, there's pretty good consensus that the world is going to get more complex and more chaotic. And so one of the questions that we could ask is, if that is a trend, that things are getting more complex and more chaotic, is the way that we run education now going to fit that complex, chaotic world? And if not, what might need to change in order for students to thrive as students and as adults in that particular world? And then you start to have a conversation around that. And then what are the possibilities? And not like getting into the downward spiral, like, oh, complexity, chaos, we can't handle it, it's all going to fall apart. Like, okay, well, what does that allow us to do if we think about this world will be complex and chaotic? Ooh, that's a great opportunity to start to think about how can we change school in a way, education in a way that helps students to manage that complexity and chaos. And how do we lead in different ways? How do we learn in different ways? So conversations of possibility, I think, are really important to remember here.
I wonder if our audience hears I guess I'll use the word irony of design for complexity and chaos, right? The intentionality of doing that, as opposed to learning from an experience. There's a difference between reactance and response, right? And when you design for it, you can respond to it. When it happens by happenstance, then it's a complete reaction to, and we get very different experiences when that happens.
Well, and is one of the trends and one of the skills for the future being able to live with that paradox. that there is this interesting dance, and how do we learn how to manage that and how to deal with that if that's going to be the reality?
Well, thanks both of you for the rich conversation this evening. I would encourage our audience to think about their own future orientation and where they may show some additional interest in thinking about the future. And again, if you enjoyed the conversation, please join our Facebook community, as well as checking out the conversations page on our website, School. Thanks so much for the conversation, guys.